Hey folks, this is Dr. Emily Sherning with American Resiliency. In this video, we're continuing a series on regional cross-model overviews, giving you information on local change trends under both conventional warming and tipping point scenarios. I brought out this cross-model approach for the first time in our Lifeboats video, but there are a lot of interesting places that didn't make the extremely high bar to be counted as a lifeboat. We'll explore other areas with good and not so good outlooks in this regional series. We looked at the Southwest previously. Now it's time to head north to the Pacific Northwest. A little background to get us on the same page. Since I published the Southwest video, we got a new update on some key Earth systems info by Copernicus, and I would highly recommend checking out this link in the video description, reading Global Climate Highlights for 2024. I think that we've got some important points made here. Average temperatures for 24 clearly exceeding the 1.5 C above pre-industrial level. And here we can see just at a glance that we're coming in at 1.6 C, above 1.5 C at 1.6 C, according to the European Union's climate operation for 2024. So that is both not cool and it's not where the scientific community expected us to be. The Earth experienced a rapid and not fully explained rise in temps in the late spring of 2023. And although we're not seeing the same frankly disturbing rate of change now as we did in the winter of 23-24, the scientific community doesn't fully understand what's going on. Well, there are a number of pretty well supported hypotheses for factors that may be contributing to this unexpected warming. When well-regarded figures like Gavin Schmidt are maintaining a position of uncertainty, it certainly supports my stance. Since March of 2024, my position has been that it's time to get weird. The evidence is on the table. We're entering a time that will continue to challenge our understanding about Earth systems. In this video, in this cross-model outlook, the first regional information we're going to focus on is how we expect the Pacific Northwest to change by 2C, because 1.6 C is not all that far away from 2C, and the 1.5 C projections in the NCA5, our primary source material, were pretty darn accurate. And as we're looking at conditions on the ground exceeding the 1.5 C projections, I think now we have a little window of understanding into why. Across the country, we're seeing both expected and unexpected impacts. And I can tell you, speaking as someone who's very familiar with these projections, seeing them unfold on the ground is still a gut punch. Things never unfold quite the way we expect. With what's happening in LA, even today, how can we not think differently about fire? And I think that fire is important to talk about as we move into the Pacific Northwest. Many of us had already accepted that there's risk involved in being in areas where the wildlands and the city come together. But in Palisades and even more so in Altadena, we're witnessing urban fire destroying neighborhoods more than a mile away from the wildlands. We know that there's more we can do to build resilience against fire. As we look at the outlook for the Pacific Northwest, I want to tell you in advance, there's going to be some upsetting stuff in this outlook. There are parts of the Pacific Northwest that are looking higher change than we might have expected, and certainly higher than we would have hoped. We're going to need to talk about fire in places where we never wanted to imagine fire, I'm sorry to say. But here's an important lens I want you to take as we begin our regional learning today. Without exception, I would say the Pacific Northwest has survivable outlooks under both conventional warming and tipping point scenarios we're going to examine today, even in areas with high change. If you're expecting a low change outlook and you get a high change outlook, that's an upsetting experience. If you are expecting to live in an area with continued forest health and you get fire in this outlook, that's emotionally a very hard card to draw. But just as I say to my friends in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where the projected fire risk increases are the highest in the nation, it is painful, but we got to look through the fires. We can steward our beautiful lands, our lands with strong ecosystems, good soil, and good water, and we can love them through this time of change. We can help bring a good future into being. And as we'll talk about in this video, in some cases, these future landscapes may look more like landscapes of the past. For the Southwest, the first projection I showed was winter change because that tells such an important story for the region. For the Pacific Northwest, I think that our crux figure is going to be different, and it's going to be a pair of figures from the 5th National Climate Assessment, the NCA5. We're going to look at figure 4.5 and 4.3. They show the projected change in snow water equivalent and projected change to precipitation. We are looking at 4.5 first, and I want to acknowledge this is painful. This tells a difficult story. Tremendous loss, more than 5 inches of loss over much of the west of snow water equivalent. Across the ensemble modeling, you see here the wettest and the driest ends of the projections. The story is fairly consistent. We are projected to lose a lot of snowpack in the Pacific Northwest. That snowpack has historically fed streams and rivers with cool water throughout the year. That cold water is essential to trout streams, to salmon, and to all of the living things that rely on salmon. But I want to show you something else before we lose hope. And that's the big picture here in 4.3, where we see projected changes in precipitation. Here we see the edges we might hold. Especially in Washington, we're looking at raw precipitation increases that just about match the snow water equivalent losses. Washington, you're going to need courage for the times ahead. And I think these projections should give your hearts some strength. In a moment, we're going to look at a side-by-side to help you see other places where the total water gap isn't looking too big. But first, I have to show you one more point of particular concern, and that's in the Willamette Valley. I want you to see that across the ensemble modeling, whether we're looking wet, weirdly intense drought in the Willamette Valley, or dry, where it's still present, we see a conserved trend, and that's an important and for many of us unexpected projection that we're looking high change over Portland. And when I talked about the landscape future looking more like the past, as I have learned and studied with many folks who have deep landscape knowledge, the landscape that is likely to emerge in the Willamette Valley is going to sound strange to us, but it is what the area may have resembled at the time of conquest, where there was not a lot of pine. The area was predominantly grasslands, was the land of the tall grasses and white oak. The Willamette Valley, I have learned through talking with people there, has a deep history of fire as a partner, and a deep history of fire resilience. So here, let's focus on the side-by-side to see the multiple cruxes of this regional water story more clearly. You can see Washington has a strong water match. Southern and central Idaho, strong water match. Where we see a picture of overall water loss is in much of Oregon, I am sorry to say, and in the Idaho Panhandle. Where we see that mismatch, where we're losing snow melt water equivalent but not gaining precipitation, that's where it's very important we think about landscape change. That's where odds are there will be fire. Across factors beyond the depth of the analysis we're covering today, I want to warn that there are especially strong signals in the fire projections for the Idaho Panhandle. We see big changes in these figures. We need to understand more factors, build our understanding as we consider the implications of these water cycle changes. For example, if you're in an area with a strong water match, but it turns out you're looking at a big heat increase, the landscape is going to have much higher water needs. Let's go over to the total heat map and look at the total projected days over 95 at 2C. To get to the total heat map, you're going to want to look at American Resiliency Visualization resources at our website, www.americanresiliency.org, where you can donate to support our work. I want to point out that if you get into our original visualizations here, they are powered by NCA 5 datasets, and they are stored safely off of government websites. So if we see a loss of access to government websites, you'll still be able to get climate projection here. For the total heat map, we're going to look at hot days at 1.5 and 2C. So looking at that tab of the visualizations, you can see just at a glance that those extreme hot season increases that we saw projected for the Southwest, fortunately, we've got a greater margin of cool as we head north. There's none of this like red 80-day hot season increase as we look north. As we zoom in, the first thing I'm going to do, I hope you'll forgive me, is expose my own heart and take a look at the Olympic Peninsula, where to the far north, we see extremely small projections of days over 95, less than 1 day over 95 additional projected as we move towards 2C. Further down the peninsula, you get 1 or 2 of them, but it's not so bad. We have a very small heat increase projected for this area and a pretty good water match where lies the whole national rainforest an area that I experience as a profoundly sacred place. And I know many of us feel very strongly about those great forests, those great coastal rainforests along the coast in the Pacific Northwest. So there is some hope in these figures that those great coastal forests may not burn. There is some hope to hold there. Some of our agricultural communities, though, are looking at substantial heat ups. Looking over in Palouse here, we're looking at about a 35-day additional hot season over 95. And that's not as big a change from the local character. Let's talk more about that in a minute, what kind of edges we have to hold there. And surprising heat up right around Boise, where we've got a 45-day increase in the hot season projected. Let's poke into that more in a minute, too. Looking down on the Oregon coast, you can see good coastal cool preservation there. You're looking nice, Tillamook County. But as we get into the valley, we start to see about 5 additional days over 95, which is a big change in character. And I'm going to show you that the hot season peak there, well short, is high, peaking regularly over 100 projected at 2C. And before I switch out of this view, I want to remind you that you can get to this visualization at AmericanResiliency.org, and you can get county level information by panning it over for anywhere in the United States on this stable visualization tool. I've moved over to the NCA 5 Atlas with the map open for days over 100 to show you Willamette Valley this warning that I want to send out to Portland loud and clear. We were talking about that 5-day peak over 95. You can see right here, we're seeing it peaking over 100 every year by 2C. I want to let you know, though, that hot season peak is projected to lie under 105. So that's comforting, but it's a huge change from the climate of 2000's Portland. Fortunately, I am confident that Portland does not need to get weird. I mean, some must get weird. Others were born to wear the mantle. And building heat resilience is going to be important for you all as you take what looks like a super scary ride back to a pre-conquest landscape. But you have good soil. You have some of the best soil in the US, and you're going to keep having drinking water. That seems very likely under all of these scenarios. The land there is going to need you to nurture it, to keep the soil covered. Think about controlled burns to keep fuel loads down and help the landscape change the way it needs to change. And think about seeding that post-burn landscape with an eye to change. There's been tremendous work done to provide and increase native plant seed banks in the Pacific Northwest. We are starting to develop the tools we're going to need for the work we're going to have to do. Here again, I'm in the NCA 5 Atlas directly, this time on the days over 105 map, looking at the heat in the greater Palouse area where we can see there's 4, in some places 5 days projected over 105C within that little bit over a month hot season projection. That is hot, no question about that. But I am not counting you out either. And man, I know I'm getting too much info on you. I'm getting too nerdy, but I want you to check this out. So this is figure 210 from the NCA 5, and check this out. As we get to 2C, I know you all are like a primary irrigation-fed agricultural community, right? You can see this shadow here lying over Columbia River watershed upstream of you, showing the Columbia is likely to be taking in a fair amount more water as we approach 2C. That will help to create stable groundwater irrigation for your agricultural landscapes. So if you keep a good eye on those groundwater levels and don't overdraw, I think you've got a real shot there in inland Washington and inland northern Oregon. This climate shift, the projected conditions you're going to see remind me of sort of a mild version of the traditional conditions for the agricultural areas that have been so important in the Southwest. In those parts of the Southwest, we're seeing huge heat increases and a significant drought trend projected, with big associated projected agricultural losses. I'm glad to see some hope that your important and beautiful region is likely to keep growing and to keep growing diverse and healthy foods. Although I think it's going to be important to explore new crops. And that whole food systems topic is worth a serious deep dive. As we look to a future where your critical agricultural region is going to be seeing days over 105, it might be worth checking out my Uganda video, which contains info on pearl millet. That's a grain that tastes pretty good, and it continues to set and fill under these projected summer conditions. No interruption to your grain growing season with pearl millet under these projected conditions. So Boise, let's check you out. On the total heat map, you were looking at a 45-day hot season increase. When I explored the high-end heat, you got 20 days over 100, 5 over 105. That's pretty crazy. By 2C, you're looking at a big winter lift too, all through that gorgeous agriculturally productive valley down there in sort of south central Idaho. The conditions projected throughout that valley look kind of like 1970s style Phoenix, 1970s, 1980s style Phoenix. That's high change. And it's not without opportunity, since Phoenix is looking increasingly like a hostile alien landscape itself. And some people, they're looking for a dry heat. But the question for you, and an important question for the region in that context of potential for growth, is are you going to be on fire? And how on fire are you going to be? I feel like we have the context we need now to read figure 7.4 from the NCA 5. You will notice that this figure is full of wavy lines that make it painfully hard to read. This is why we're going to be using the slightly altered version that Ash, a professional architect based in Boise, Idaho, who has given us such wonderful information on building heat resilience and fire resilience, has put some state overlays on this. I find this a lot easier to look at myself. And if you feel like this is also going to hurt your brain less substantially to study this modified figure, I'm happy to email you a copy to anyone interested. You can get me at ar@americanresiliency.org. So we see here really big regional changes. When we look at Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, it's a huge regional increase in the risk for large wildfires. I have to be serious with you. If you see white, that doesn't mean you're safe. It means you're not modeled. And this figure is hard to read. You can't just look at it and take it in intuitively. I want to talk you through how to use it because you got to do math. You're going to multiply your right hand and your left hand figures because look at this. The left and right hand figures have totally different scales. If we're looking at the left hand, we're talking about the average number of days. If we're looking at this right hand scale, it's the change in number of days expressed as a percent. Why did they do this? I don't know. But we can solve this problem with multiplication. We'll be okay. You can see that here by the Idaho-Montana border, the risk increase is particularly large. In areas where we're going from pale yellow to dark, we're talking about especially large percentage risk increases in areas that may not have a lot of fire resilience or fire culture built up. People may not be aware of the danger that is coming in areas that are going from pale yellow to dark. And it hurts my heart to see that projected throughout the Cascades. We are looking at a 400% increase in fire risk along the Cascades, including some areas where fire was quite rare before. And I find that to be a real tragedy to take in. You know, I'm recording this after I already worked on the script a long time. And every time I look at these figures for the Pacific Northwest, I have to sit and feel the pain a little bit. I have to say, of all the American regions, I find your projections the most painful. Part of that is because the size of these projected changes are so much larger than in the previous NCA series. The NCA 4 had a lot more winter and water stability projected for the Pacific Northwest than we see now in the NCA 5. As scientists begin to understand the Arctic amplification effect, where we're seeing the most warming at the poles, that is changing our projections for the northernmost parts of our country. We see big change in the projections for Maine, too, in the NCA 5 versus the NCA 4. And I think it's important to say here and now that many of you who live in the region began feeling that potential for high change years ago because I heard from you. I've been hearing from you on the ground since I released my first Washington Outlook related to NCA 4 projections. Many people on the ground wrote me regarding that first Washington Outlook that they had evidence of current changes that they wanted me to see. And I want to thank you all for your ground reports and let folks know that I am always glad to receive ground reports. That's how I can connect on the ground when I live in Iowa with places all around the U.S. is by you contributing ground reports. People shared personal temperature records that they had kept in Washington. People shared pictures of cedars dying from heat and water stress in the midst of forests that otherwise looked healthy. And I know enough to know that cedar is the indicator species to watch there. and that cedar is as precious and close to the heart of your regional identity as salmon. For those who don't know, the 24 salmon season was canceled in Washington. Fisheries were closed because the salmon are doing so poorly. And we have photographs. We have modern era evidence of these rivers being so full of salmon that they were rivers of salmon. They were a flowing pathway of shining light. They were just a corridor of thrashing biomass, a gift that has sustained lifeways, some of which are said to have been amongst the most pleasant and relaxed lifeways on Earth for generations and untold generations. This salmon was a gift that fed the great forests, that connected the land and the sea, biomass and nutrients from the land and the sea in a profound cycle, a stronger cycle that created those conditions for those forests to live and thrive in such immense richness. The changes projected for the Pacific Northwest, they're changes that cut at the hearts of those who love this land. Now, this is a cross-model outlook, right? We're seeing signs from Earth systems right now that we may have hit a tipping point. We're observing strange changes in the ocean and in other elements of Earth systems. I'll get into it in my next Earth systems update. You may have seen news articles talking about possible AMOC collapse. There was also a popular article recently circulated saying that AMOC is fine, using data that only went up to 2022 before we started observing these changes. So I don't think it's so fine, folks. If we saw AMOC collapse, that would lead to big changes in heat circulation in the oceans. AMOC collapse is the scientific name for our best understood emergency off switch in Earth's climate. It's our best understood tipping point. We have paleoclimate evidence that this system has collapsed before, and there are signs that Mother Earth has hit that metaphorical red button. If we have hit this tipping point, which it's hard to say what's happening as unexpected things are happening, all I can do is look at the signs and put the evidence on the table. If we have hit this tipping point, the size of the changes facing the world are going to just whack the heck out of us as a global civilization. All of you who hang out with me here, you know I'm a bright side type thinker. I do not see how global civilization or global food systems could conceivably make it through the projected changes of AMOC collapse, which would bring about a time of great storms. In the time of storms, we will need local systems and local lifeways. What would these changes do to the Pacific Northwest if we saw the time of storms come? I want to show you. There's 2 places in the US where this global catastrophe might boost your local chances a tiny bit in some ways, and your region holds one. Looking at temperature, you got a near term, so this is like 50 to 100 years out, average model cooling trend that would reduce the temperature in your region by about 2°C. So a good like opposing trend that's going to push on that warming trend. Maybe that'll keep it from getting too hot. And you can see that over in Northern Europe, we're talking about more like a minus 22°C cooling trends, which sounds like more of a problem. So this is a nice, moderate, potentially helpful cooling trend. But more important is the precipitation trend looking that far out. Check this out. Check this out. Over the Monongahela, over those coastal forests, and this is a big area of potential increased precipitation that could hit the Cascades, right? I feel like that could hit over the Cascades. And then I saw this other spot here, and I wondered what was going on with that over this part of Southeast Asia. It's the last great old growth forests of Southeast Asia over this. And I am not supposed to talk like this, right? Like a scientist isn't supposed to talk like this, but I feel a mythic energy in this correlation. It feels like the ancient forests are involved in this response in some way that reaches beyond the physics that are used to model these papers and reach towards life. And I wonder about it. And I'll like take off my woo hat now, but I wanted you to see that. Because for parts of the region of the Pacific Northwest, you are projected to experience additional drought stress. You know, that blue area doesn't cover the whole Pacific Northwest in this collapse scenario, in the time of storm scenario. But taking some edge off the continued warming, that would help you. And I think that all of us within the region of the Pacific Northwest and without, if you have a feeling heart, that it should give us a measure of grace and strength to consider a future where the remaining great forests of the coast live on and where the great forests of the Cascades may not burn. I'm popping this up again and zooming in so you can see that blue bit there where there's no drought projected. It goes far inland, it goes all the way to the Cascades. If we're going to live in the beginning of the time of storms, if the signs that we're seeing from Earth systems are indeed signs of AMOC collapse, they're terrible in an unvarnished way. The time of great storms is not good. This is not the time that you would choose to live in, I think, if you had your pick of the matter. But it gives me a meaningful measure of comfort to hold any rational hope in my heart that these great forests may survive. When if we continue the path that we're on, if we continue without tipping points in a conventional warming pathway, it looks so likely the Cascades will burn. It makes me feel a little better to know that there's a future out there where maybe they don't. The odds for Oregon for water systems and forest health in Oregon also look better in that collapse scenario, in that tipping point scenario. So globally, super bad. Small parts of the Pacific Northwest, maybe a little better. That's the tipping point impact projected for the Pacific Northwest. We've got a particularly strong differential in the outcomes for the great forests of the Pacific Northwest, potentially if we should hit a tipping point or not. And the Southwest video, we considered a future that was pretty grim for a lot of the region, both ways, both scenarios. Continued warming or collapse, they both looked pretty bad for some pretty large, highly populated parts of the region. Under both scenarios there in the Southwest, we're looking at projected conditions where many living things will die, and where the projected conditions are so extreme, there really aren't so many North American analogs. I must say that in the regional outlook for the Pacific Northwest, we are looking at some scary high levels of change. I want to acknowledge that. But we have good analog ecosystems for the change, no matter which way it goes. Any of these futures we're talking about, there's a potential for rich and flowering life in the Pacific Northwest. It's hard, though, really needing to embrace uncertainty. And in your region, which is noted in the NCA 4 and the NCA 5, to be impacted by a higher rate of unusual events, higher rate in your region of extreme events and disasters than other parts of the US. It's just your geographic nature. And I mean, thinking about disasters beyond climate, your vulnerability to earthquakes, as you can see here, and in some cases to related tsunamis, is quite high. Kind of interesting to note in your region, that high change area around Boise, that if you could get a really good fire culture practice going in there, might be desirable for some people. A little break in the earthquake action right there. In your region, the uncertainty you need to embrace can feel particularly threatening. Of course it can. The changes people are experiencing now are very serious. Your region has been experiencing heat domes, wildfires, up a little north, up in BC, just terrible flooding with major infrastructure impacts. Some people talk about this as the new normal, but that's really not enough, because the changes we're experiencing now are the beginning of a change process. We can't think about this as the new normal because change is going to continue. We're not yet at conditions like those projected at 2C, and it's going to keep going. Speaking to you on the ground, there are many factors I didn't feel able to fit into this video that are very important for your local outlook. In particular, Seattle. I hadn't mentioned you yet, and that's because your situation isn't super high change like Portland or Boise, but higher end sea level rise is going to mess you up in a pretty serious way. And if we look at hitting that tipping point, higher end sea level rise is coming fast. So for more details on outlooks for Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, exploring more factors at 2C, including sea level rise and more information about changes to the oceans and the coast, I'm going to advise you to go to the main page of the YouTube channel, youtube.com/American Resiliency, and search on there for, say, Washington. Search for Washington. Look, that's the old one. That's from the NCA 4, before we hit this tipping point where we really need to focus on 2C way before 2050. You want the NCA 5 update, 2C update. That's going to give you the most up-to-date information. You can look for any state and you'll find that information here. Folks, closing out, there's power, potential, and peril in the outlook for your region. The changes to your water cycle, the changes from a snow to a rain-driven water cycle are going to drive landscape transformation, and that means fire. Thinking seriously about fire resilience. Building fire resilience in this region, especially in the Cascades and the Idaho Panhandle, is going to be critical for your regional resilience in the time to come. For those of you who love this land, there is hope. There will be life. These are outlooks where life can survive, but there's a lot of work to do. Let's get ready. Folks, thanks for spending some time learning with me. American Resiliency is a donor-supported nonprofit. We're focused on helping everyone access climate information so we can respond to the changes that are coming. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to the AR community, to our donors, our volunteers, to everyone spreading the word, and to everyone doing the work on the ground. If you'd like to donate, you can find the button for that at the top right corner of our webpage, www.americanresiliency.org. Thanks for getting ready with me, and talk with you again soon.